So let's go ahead and move on to our second presentation, which examines how grocery shopping changes with economic conditions. And for our authors, what they've done is they've examined more than 5,000 households over 8 years to analyze the grocery shopping behavior of these customers. And what they uncover are some fairly pronounced effects on various types of shopping behavior within households. So we're joined by two of the authors, Thomas Schuldra and Julian Wickman from the University of Cologne. And we look forward to having their insights. So let me go ahead and turn the control over to them. There we go. And invite them to proceed. Welcome.
All right, Chris, thanks for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I'm Thomas Schuldra, and I'm joined by my colleague Julian Wickman. Two other authors, Mike Eisenweis from the University of Cologne, from the University of Bremen, and Werner Reinartz from the University of Cologne, have also participated in this project. And yeah, we are very excited to present some insights because we think this is a very timely topic, right? Especially in the context of the last almost 1.5 years, which took a toll on the global economy, on personal income, and of course also shaped how people consume, how people purchase. And this is the core of our paper. So for the German population and the German market, we have seen some dramatic decreases in personal individual microeconomic conditions, right, which are represented basically by disposable income. So in 2020 in Germany, and I think this can be transferred to a lot of global economies, a lot of people, around 1 million job losses occurred during the pandemic. We had a lot of people turning over to short-time work, right, which also decreases disposable income. Real wage declined by almost over 1% in 2020, and over a third in general and in total suffered from income losses, right? And if income losses occur, this impacts people's ability to purchase, right? On the other hand, what we have seen also is that macroeconomic conditions change, right? GDP decreases, consumer confidence decreases, and even though this does not in general translate to the income level, it may impact the willingness of consumers to purchase, right? Because expectations are also correlated to the global or to the general macroeconomic conditions. And in the end, when consumers anticipate or perceive continued economic problems, it kind of is human instinct that it leads maybe to two possible actions, right? Reducing spending altogether or changing buying behavior. And in the global or Great Recession during 28 and 29, for example, for the US market, we have perceived and experienced over an 8% decrease in annual spending for US households, which translated to over $500 billion of foregone revenues, right? So retailers, manufacturers, and market participants suffer directly. And what can we expect how consumers change their purchase behavior, right? For durable goods, we actually know, which is also quite intuitive, that economizing on quantity per se is possible, right? So you can reduce your consumer spending, you can postpone purchases, that may work out. For groceries, however, this kind of is limited, right? Economizing on quantity is limited because you have to buy groceries up until a certain level. You can reduce total spending and purchase value, but this is kind of limited. You can try to focus on promotional prices, right? So reducing the average price level that you pay. But Another option, of course, is also that economizing on the price may work about how you purchase, right? So changing or exchanging more expensive national brands for cheaper private labels, or purchasing in cheaper discounters compared to maybe more expensive supermarkets. So what we have looked into basically are 7 relevant and managerial outcomes that holistically describe shopping behavior, right? So we looked into how much a household does purchase, represented by the shopping basket value, right? So the total spending of the basket or the household within the basket, the purchase volume that may be adjusted in the context of changing economic conditions, and as mentioned, a price index that kind of represents how focused a household is on promotional items, price reduced items, etc. And on the other side, we have the shopping basket allocation, right, which includes possibilities to kind of shift spendings across brand types or store types, and in the end represents how and where and what a household purchases. And this, of course, can be driven very differently by the macroeconomic conditions or the microeconomic conditions represented by economic expansions, contractions, or income gains and income losses. And one may assume actually that those kind of economic conditions are related, right? Of course, during contractions, it's more likely that an income loss may occur, but actually the correlations in our data had been very small, and being an indicator that there might be very separate effects at work that should be also considered distinctively. So the research context then has been the German grocery retail market, which provides some special characteristics that are very suitable for an investigation like this, because in Germany we have quite a high discounter revenue share, right? Discounters are maybe not that well known for the US viewers and participants here, are kind of stores that are a bit smaller than supermarkets. So it's not the typical Walmart. They are smaller from the sales area than a typical supermarket, have then fewer SKUs, but have also a substantially lower price level, and carry a much larger assortment of private labels. But those are very representative or represented here at the German retail market. But on the other side, also non-discounters like regular supermarkets in general carry, compared to maybe other countries, quite a high private label share, right? So up to 21%, which allows consumers basically to purchase combinations of all kinds with regard to the store type they purchase and the brand type they want to purchase. So we had consumer scanner panel from GfK Germany covering the years 2006 and 2014. So we had the Great Recession right in the middle of our data frame. We had daily transaction data for all participants in the panel, with yearly survey data on socio-demographics and psychographics. So the core characteristic here, of course, has been the income variable, right? But we also had psychographics on expectations with regard to potential income changes or changes of the personal economic condition. And we had these data for the transaction data for over 85,000 unique households. We concentrated on a subset of over 5,000 households with extensive purchase histories and survey information, meaning that we concentrated on those that had been in the sample for the entire time frame from 2006 and 2014. We made sure that those are representative and structurally not different than the remaining households, and this is true. So we are quite confident that this subset is still representative. And overall, we covered 13 million shopping trips with almost 50 million purchases from 39 product categories and almost 500 retailers with multiple stores. And yeah, now I will hand over to Julian, who will provide some key insights of this paper.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So I'm going to present the results, and we're going to first focus on what happens when micro conditions changes. So what happens if households experience an income gain or an income loss. So let's first look at income loss, which is the light blue bars here. And what we see for basket value, so how much does a household purchase, is that when households experience an income loss, they reduce spending, they reduce the quantities they purchase, right? And when we then look at how they allocate their budget, so how do they purchase and where do they purchase, what do they purchase, we see that this reduction in consumption especially affects private labels and discounters and national brands and non-discounters. So actually income losses reduce spending on the most expensive options as well as on the cheapest options. And interestingly, also, we don't see significant effects for income gains on shopping behavior. When we now go ahead and look at the other side of the coin, the macro conditions, we have the expansions in dark blue and the contractions in lighter blue. And what we see here is a quite interesting picture in that the contractions lead actually to an increase in total spending and an increase in quantities purchased. And this is actually in line with also earlier studies who had a similar context. And what you also need to keep in mind here is that by really disentangling macro and micro conditions, we are keeping income fixed in this case, right? So we're really purely looking what happens if GDP changes, but income stays fixed. And on the other hand, when we then look at expansion, what we see is that the prices that households pay get lower. So they shop more promotional items, and they're able in this way to pay lower prices during expansions. When we then go ahead and look at how households allocate their baskets, we see that during contractions, quite interestingly, they do indeed shop more frugally, right? They increase spending on private labels, increase spending on private labels and discounters as well as non-discounters, and they decrease spending on national brands and national brands and discounters. So they actually shift the way they shop also, not just the level, but also they shift the way they shop, shifting to other brands, to other store formats. And then for the expansions, what we see is in the expansion, keeping income fixed, nonetheless, they do switch from the cheaper options. They do switch from private label and discounters, private label and non-discounters, towards national brands and non-discounters. So here again, we see this shift happening in expansions. So quite a different picture that we see here for micro and macro conditions. And to summing up our key results is that we do find very strong effects of micro and macro conditions, but they're not the same. They're really distinct from one another, and they're also asymmetric for positive and negative conditions, right? And then when we look at income loss, what we see is income losses change how much households buy, reducing how much households buy, and therefore also how much they spend. Whereas macro conditions change not only how much they buy, but also how, where, and what they shop, right? Switching to different outlets, switching to different types of brands. And during contractions, we see that households buy more, but at the same time, they also shop more frugally by buying private labels, which is really interesting, I think. And explaining the mechanisms, what we think is happening here is that households actually seem to be influenced by the overall level of uncertainty that is happening because of the contraction. Maybe shopping frugally becomes en vogue. Everybody is doing that, so they also switch to private labels. but because we keep income constant, these households don't experience an actual budget constraint. So they are not really limited in their budgets, which may actually lead them to shop more, spend more at the end, although they buy more frugally. So spending really only decreases when households are directly affected on a personal micro level. And what we then see for expansions is that households, similar to contractions, in expansions, households get infected by the overall more positive sentiment, and they switch towards more expensive national brands in non-discounters, and they afford this by purchasing more promotional products. And interestingly, income gains, we find no immediate effects on shopping behavior. So what does it mean for marketers? Let's first focus on micro conditions. So micro conditions alone today might still be hard to detect for marketers, but looking in the future, it might become more and more feasible with greater data availability, more powerful prediction models, more shopping happening online, from which we can deduce micro conditions. So in that way, in the future, marketers will be able to directly react to changing micro conditions. And then looking at the macro condition level, we can also suggest to marketers to fine-tune their strategies to consumers and areas that are affected more on a micro level, right? What we saw in the great financial recession is that for the US, for example, the effects were very different depending on the area you lived in, right? And also now with the Corona crisis, not every person is affected the same way, not every industry is affected the same way, and in that way, marketers could tailor their strategies to those areas which are affected to a greater or lower degree. And finally, during contractions, we would also recommend retailers to expand their private label portfolio because private labels are very sought after. We would recommend discounters to narrow their price gap to supermarkets because they become more popular in contractions, and then they can again widen the price gap in expansions to keep consumers in their stores. And we would also recommend marketers to avoid price reductions. We saw no big changes in the prices paid for contractions, and so they should avoid reducing prices and rather give consumers other opportunities to restore control. Because of the uncertainty, consumers might enjoy greater levels of control and a perception of frugality, and they could do that, for example, by offering loyalty rewards, distributing the good old store flyer, which helps consumers to plan their purchases, and also offer a larger package size, which are associated with a cheaper buying with a good deal, right? So these are our recommendations for marketers, and we're really excited for your questions.
Thank you, Thomas and Julian. That's very interesting, and we now have a chance to.
You're just muted, Chris.
Sorry about that. I meant to, so I don't know if you heard what I said, which was thank you first, and that also to encourage our listeners to ask questions in the Q&A tab. So let me go ahead and start with a couple questions. Maybe the question that's on everybody's mind is the question about COVID. So how do your results translate into what's happening now with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, our data frame covered the Great Recession, which was also a crisis, but a bit of a different crisis. So I think there are some special situations now with COVID, especially that some sectors are really just affected very, very hard, whereas other sectors maybe don't feel the crisis at all, or maybe even have more disposable income because they didn't go on vacation, because they don't eat out or cannot eat out as much. So this heterogeneity is much greater today in the COVID situation. So using our model, I think what translates well is that we disentangle the micro and the macro. So for the people who are really affected on the micro level, we would expect to see the strong decrease in spending. Whereas for those who are subjected to the crisis, which is pretty much every one of us, but not financially directly, those people might actually end up spending more. And maybe this is also something that explains this irrational type of shopping behavior that we see around the world during the lockdowns. I think in Germany it was buying tons of toilet paper. I think in France it was buying tons of wine. I'm actually not sure if it was in the US. Yeah, but this might also help explain that.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, since you brought up the intertwining, the way that you dealt with macro and micro separately, what happens? Did you do some additional analysis to consider what happens when they co-occur, which of course happens quite a bit? So what happens with consumer behavior there?
What is quite interesting is basically that we found the substantial same results when controlling for interacting micro and macro conditions. So all the effects that we have found from the individual effects stayed the same, plus none of the interactions have been really significant. So this is a strong indication that micro and macro really works differently, and which makes it even more important to control for both economic conditions in the modeling part.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps even easier to get a handle on the predictions, because it's pretty clear, that one is operating. And you mentioned, you spoke a lot about income, but we know that there are other kinds of macroeconomic or microeconomic conditions at the household level that are that affect wealth. So did you have any other ways that you looked at changes in wealth in the study?
We had no hard facts on wealth, like savings or properties, etc. But what we had was an indicator for the expectations and perceptions of the individual economic conditions. So based on survey information from the households, how they perceive their personal income or personal economic situation, and how they expect this to change within the next 12 months. We had this, unfortunately, just for a shorter time frame. So I guess it was from 2009 to the end of our time frame. But nevertheless, controlling for those effects, again, nothing changed with regard to our core insights, plus all the effects resulting from the perceptions of individual economic conditions had been quite plausible, right? So if someone expected the personal economic conditions to improve within the next 12 months, this had quite plausible impact on how this household purchased grocery.
Interesting. So maybe we can close with marketing, which of course I see a lot of marketers here. And as I say that, I'm also noticing that we do have the article and the managerial summary in the Q&A if anyone wants to click through and see those papers in more completely. But just to finish with marketing, what's marketing's approach to this? I mean, what did you see marketers doing, or what would you advise marketers to do? What kind of suggestions do you have for marketers coming out of the paper? How to use their marketing instruments?
That's a great question. So what we know already from past literature is also that during a contraction, you shouldn't stop advertising. And I think that's also something we saw recently again during the COVID crisis, that those companies who stopped advertising also lost market shares. So this goes for our results as well. And we can add to that retailers and marketers should also not focus on price promotions too much. They might be worried in contractions to lower their prices to regain market shares. But actually, what we would recommend really is to rather focus on this perceived uncertainty of consumers and address this type of uncertainty really helping consumers to give them a sense of security, to restore control, which can happen in a variety of ways. It can happen through advertising, through the message that I send through advertising, or through more concrete measures like providing them small flyers so they can go ahead, sit down before the shop and plan their shopping, and that way feel more certainty, feel more predictability in times of uncertainty. So I think that's one of the strongest indications that we have for what marketers should do, is rather to address this increased level of uncertainty by giving consumers control.
Got it. So I see one question from Shanta, which is, I think your data is, he or she's asking about analyzing the effects of COVID. You did have COVID. That is included in your data. I think that's in the time frame that you studied, correct?
It's not.
It's not.
We have the time frame 2008 to 2014. 2006 to 2014 even. So the pandemic unfortunately wasn't in there, but we would be really excited to get our hands on that data and to run the regressions again and to look what happened.
Yeah, because we definitely know, as you mentioned earlier, that it affected the choice of products, the volume of many products. There was some irrationality. Plus, when people couldn't do their regular entertainment activities, they may have been looking to extend, do more elaborate cooking at home. You know, they couldn't go out, etc. So, well, we'll look for that as the next study, and appreciate that very much. So I think we'll go ahead and transition here to the end. So first, let me thank you, Julian and Thomas, for a wonderful talk. And as I mentioned earlier, for people who want to take a deeper dive, and there's quite a bit to dive into on both of these papers. And actually, they dovetail. I was noticing by the responses that you guys were giving, they dovetail actually really nicely. So you could think about quality signaling, which the first paper talked about, and buying market share through lowering prices and promotions. So I think there's some very, very nice connections. So I encourage everybody to look at the papers in more detail.